everyone. Welcome to our briefing. This briefing is presented by WorldAware. WorldAware provides intelligence-driven integrated risk management solutions that enable organizations to operate globally with confidence. WorldAware's end-to-end tailored solutions, integrated world-class threat intelligence, innovative technology, and response services help organizations mitigate risk and protect their people, assets, and brand reputation. Today, we'll be hearing from Jonathan Keemer. Jonathan is a senior intelligence manager at WorldAware, analyzing threats across Europe and Russia, and has worked in the travel security sector for a decade. He has a master's degree in W&D proliferation and international security from King's College London and a BSc in economics. Jonathan is going to get us started by providing some background on this dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan and what impact it may have on regional stability. Jonathan?
Thanks, Mary. So, fighting between Armenian-aligned and Azerbaijani military forces broke out early on September the 27th. The exact circumstances of the events are very difficult to ascertain. Both sides typically issue claim and counterclaim to shape the narrative to support their policy objectives. Information from the combat zone is therefore dubious, and it takes time to clarify precisely what's going on. But on first glance, it appears that Azerbaijan launched a large-scale offensive against multiple points along the Nagorno-Karabakh line of contact. They claim that this was a response to Armenian artillery strikes against several border villages. The heaviest fighting appears to be concentrated in the Agdam, Fuzuli Jebrail, Mardakert, Martuni, and Talish sectors of the line of contact, as well as the Muravdag Mountains in the north. Azerbaijan also claims that it's pushing to liberate the city of Fuzuli in the south, which, though it's been in ruins and deserted since Azerbaijan lost it in the 90s, it would have great symbolic value if it could be recovered. The forward edge of the battle area is spread along the whole line of contact, indicating that this is an offensive of unprecedented scale in recent years. If Azerbaijan can seize and hold high ground in these sectors, particularly around Muravdag, it would allow it to look down on and dominate major supply routes connecting Armenia-controlled Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia proper. So it is possible that this is the immediate objective of the Azerbaijani offensive. The fighting has involved armoured and infantry forces supported by artillery, as well as manned and unmanned aircraft. Baku claims that it seized key positions during the fighting, particularly in the Fuzuli Jebrail area, and it claims to have destroyed an Armenian motorized regiment around Martuni. This sounds probably unrealistic, and Armenia predictably denies it, reporting that it's actually recaptured some of the lost ground. Since the fighting broke out, Azeri sources report that the Armenian forces have shelled several locations within Azerbaijan, while Karabakh sources have denounced Azerbaijan for targeting artillery on civilian areas, including the city of Stepanakert. Dozens of civilians are reported to have been killed on both sides of the line of contact. Although the fighting remains focused along the line of contact in Nagorno-Karabakh, incidents have been reported along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border elsewhere. Baku alleges that Armenian forces shelled the Dashkisan region of Azerbaijan from Vardinis, which is approximately 20 kilometers from the border. Yerevan military sources report that Azerbaijan launched air and artillery strikes against an Armenian military facility in Vardinis and claim that a civilian bus in the vicinity was destroyed by an Azeri drone. A major development yesterday was that Yerevan claimed that a Turkish aircraft operating out of Azerbaijan shot down an Armenian attack aircraft within Armenian airspace. There's been no evidence to support this claim, and Turkey denies it. So this could either be more disinformation or it could be a major escalation. It could be that the Armenian aircraft crashed. Military air accidents tend to increase during combat operations. We don't know. But we're leaning towards the view that if an aircraft crashed at all, it was accidental. Armenia's southern border with the Azerbaijan territory of Nakhchivan is quiet. We don't think Armenia will make any aggressive move there, as this would be a major escalation that would be extremely antagonistic for Turkey. Now, tensions had been elevated in the region and sporadic attacks had been ongoing since July, when opposing military units clashed north of the line of contact on the border separating Armenia's Tavush district and Azerbaijan's Tovuz district. Such clashes are reasonably routine, so what makes the latest outbreak different? Well, the scale seems unprecedented in recent years. The length of the apparent front line seems to be greater than that during the 4 days of combat operations in 2016, which was the last time we saw major fighting in the area. But the big difference is that since the Nagorno-Karabakh ceasefire in 1994, neither side has gone so far as to declare an actual mobilization of their armed forces, calling up reservists. Neither side has previously declared martial law and basically gone into a national war footing. In Armenia, we're now seeing hospitals ceasing routine treatment as part of the move to a war footing. In Azerbaijan, we've seen the impositions of local curfews in many places, restrictions of flight services from civilian airports, requisition of public service vehicles for use by the military, and restrictions on social media activity, presumably so that the government can control the public narrative. These preparations suggest that, if necessary, both countries are in it for the long haul. And sure, if one side calls up reserves, then the other one's got little choice but to do the same, regardless of their strategic intention. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're clamoring for a protracted war. Now, we think the impact of combat operations is likely to be limited to Nagorno-Karabakh and the border areas to the north. Although both sides have a limited capability of launching attacks deeper within their opponent's hinterland, say with airstrikes or rocket artillery, we believe they'll be reluctant to do so. Both sides have very few longer range ballistic missiles, and their attack aircraft are better suited to close air support for troops on the ground than they are for longer range strike operations. And this suggests that the militaries of both sides are tailored more to fight a local border war, and it could also indicate a fundamental political reluctance to escalate into a total war along the entire border. Azerbaijan has very strong air defense capabilities, which would likely deter Armenia's relatively weak strike capability. On the flip side, Armenia has less of an air defense capability, but Russian long-range air defense systems are reportedly deployed at Gyumri, which could deter Azerbaijan, as well as Turkey, if the Turkish attempted to become directly involved. So the military threat will likely be confined to within the range of the opposing side's artillery, as well as armed drones, so say within 30 kilometres of either side of the border. And you can see the shaded areas on the map along the border indicate 30 kilometres. The US Embassy in Yerevan appears to support the assessment that the fighting will be contained in the short term, and it's only issued a warning so far against travel south of Yerevan and east of Lake Sevan, which isn't shown on the map, but it's just to the northwest of Vardinis. Away from the combat zone, the most visible impact will be the effects of both countries assuming a war footing. Nighttime curfews around Azerbaijan, unavailability of routine hospital treatments in Armenia, possible interruptions of internet and telecommunications services, etc. The calling up of public vehicles for military use could also have an effect on public services, supplies of non-essential goods, and so on. We could see road traffic disruptions on major routes feeding into the combat zone as both sides pour more forces into the area. So east of Yerevan, the major route via Vardinis toward Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the Lachin road further south, could see traffic restrictions and heightened security measures to facilitate military movements, for example. International entry and exit into both countries could be disrupted too. Baku's Haidar Aliyev International Airport is currently running restricted services, and several airlines have cancelled flights to the region out of an abundance of caution. It's worth mentioning, though, that even before the latest hostilities, passenger flights connecting with Yerevan or Baku would ensure that they flew well clear of the border and the disputed areas, so the threat to civilian aircraft is low. The main security threat away from the battle zone will likely come from large-scale demonstrations in major cities of Armenia or Azerbaijan. We saw large and disruptive demonstrations in Baku in July during the fighting then, and more are likely, and sometimes these can turn violent and they are best avoided. And outside of the region, protests by Armenian and Azeri diasporas globally are also likely. Now, some further intensification of the fighting, accompanied by high-profile sensational media stories, are likely over the coming days, but we still assess that the impact will remain confined to the shared border areas. We'll wait to see what develops around Armenia's claims of Turkish involvement. If it's true, it wouldn't necessarily indicate a wider threat within Armenia. In the unlikely event that Turkey is providing direct military support to Azerbaijan, it will likely be focused toward Nagorno-Karabakh. However, while Russia is friendly to Azerbaijan, it has a military alliance with Armenia, and it's unlikely to welcome the Turkish military operating within its sphere of influence. So we would then see a major ramping up of diplomatic tensions between Moscow and Ankara if Turkish military involvement is confirmed. From the Turkish point of view, while Turkey has shown that it's not afraid to stand up to Moscow, realistically they're unlikely to want to antagonize Russia too much. Russia is the source of much of Turkey's gas and oil supplies, as well as a major trading partner. So claims of direct Turkish military involvement might be overblown at this stage. Precedent suggests that international pressure will dissuade both sides from escalating into full state-on-state conflict along the whole border, and the fighting, if not the tensions, will probably abate in the short term. The presence of major gas and oil pipelines in the region will mean that other regional and world powers will want to contain the crisis as well. And both sides have so far rejected mediation. Azerbaijan is framing its objective as the liberation of the occupied territories. However, its immediate aim is likely to be bite and hold, so to seize some key terrain, which might then allow it to call a pause, declare a victory, and negotiate from a position of strength. The war fever currently gripping Azerbaijan is quite something. Even the opposition media appears to be rallying around the president. And today we've seen reliable reports that hundreds of people in Baku are lining up to give blood to assist the military casualties. This war fever suggests Baku can't really back down until it can point to some success on the battlefield. We're looking at several triggers which would indicate that the crisis could develop to pose a wider threat to operations outside of the immediate combat area. However, it is important when looking at developments in the region to ignore the rhetoric and bear in mind that a lot of the immediate reports you'll see on the media will be wildly inaccurate or exaggerated. So what we're looking out for are incidents away from the border areas. So for example, aircraft being shot down over Armenia or Azerbaijan proper, such as the Armenians alleged happened yesterday. Reports of long-range attacks on strategic infrastructure well within Armenia or Azerbaijan. Like I say, we don't think this is likely, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Reports of ground operations other than cross-border artillery strikes along the Armenia and Azerbaijan border proper. Again, it's unlikely, but it would be a major escalation. And finally, evidence of foreign military involvement primarily by Turkey or possibly Russia. We could see that a Turkish drone has been shot down along Armenia's western border, for example, or we could see reports that Russia is providing air support to Armenia. Things like that could really inflame the situation. It's a fast-moving situation. We'll continue to monitor developments and update clients on how developments could impact them going forward.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker today is Tony Rocafort. Tony is a senior security consultant with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response Team. He previously worked as a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict, and is also a veteran of the U.S. Army Special Forces. Tony is going to discuss the current security recommendations for organizations operating in the region. Tony?
All right, thanks, Mary. Thanks, John, for that sit rep as well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. I'm just going to get ahead of this now. WorldAware has had some preliminary inquiries regarding evacuation from the region, but we have not been asked to activate assets for any clients as of yet. WorldAware does have resources on the ground to support should clients decide to evacuate. Charter air is a possibility in addition to limited commercial air assets, but as John said, the situation on the ground is extremely fluid, so options and availability of assets are going to change hourly. Okay, as Mary said, I've been asked to offer some very high-level advice to help personnel impacted by the situation in the region enhance their resilience. For clients with personnel in the region, it's a good idea to start getting accountability of your people if you haven't already done so. Don't rely on an itinerary that was submitted 6 months ago. Contact them directly and confirm their exact location. In addition to the address of their residence, make sure that you record the location of their work site as well, and consider designating a tertiary location, some kind of safe haven for future link ups if necessary. More on that in a minute. Set up a detailed communications plan with each person. Designate specific windows for check-ins and have clear escalation procedures written out for your staff or support teams in the event multiple check-ins are missed, your personnel miss multiple check-in windows. If you have resources available, escalation procedures or what we call a no comms plan should ideally include some kind of plan for face-to-face wellness checks with personnel, either via another staff member, local first responders, or contracted security personnel. On the technology side, when setting up a comms plan, the more options, the better. Remember the acronym PACE, Primary, Alternate, Contingency, and Emergency. We want to have backups for our backups in the event our primary comms are disabled or ineffective for whatever reason. 4 iPhones operating on the same network is not a redundant communications plan. You want to incorporate as many different modes of communication into your plan as possible, as laid out here. A final note on comms in these conflict areas: have your people sanitize their media devices too. Make sure your people are not photographing or recording police or military movements or checkpoints. Have your people scrub their phones, tablets, laptops, whatever, for any of that type of content, particularly if they're planning to head to the airport anytime soon. Deleting texts, threads, timelines, anything mentioning retweeting or whatever the hip new social media verb is, something related to that conflict, delete it now. Ideally, some sort of go bag is part of your everyday carry already, but it's especially important to have one on hand if you're traveling in a dynamic, potentially kinetic environment. At a minimum, go bags need to have all key identification, important contact information, and travel documents, credit cards, and cash, ideally enough to sustain you for at least 96 hours. Any required medication with your physician's prescription, if applicable, extra communications devices, and backup power supplies fully charged at all times, of course. High energy snacks, bottled water, some kind of water treatment, either iodine tabs or some kind of filter. Flashlight with extra batteries and some rain gear is a good idea too. Once you have your go bag packed, try to leave it packed and keep it close by at all times. But like I said, make sure you keep your electronics, your essential electronics, fully charged at all times. Next, we'll cover a little bit about shelter in place and evacuation planning. These are some very high level talking points, but evac and shelter in place plans are serious business. There's a lot that goes into them. When devising shelter in place plans, ideally we want to have at least a 3-week supply of potable water, ideally 1 gallon per person per day, as well as high energy shelf stable foods, ideally 1,500 to 3,000 calories worth per person per day. We also want to ensure that we have adequate toiletries and personal hygiene items for all impacted personnel. We need medical supplies, trauma kits, AEDs, as well as people who know how to use that kind of equipment. If we have people taking prescription medications, we need to have a plan in place to ensure they can get refills in the event of a prolonged shelter in place. Just like with our comms plan, redundancy is key here. So make sure you have backup plans for your water, food, medical, and fuel resupply. If resupply poses a challenge, make sure you have some kind of rationing plan in place as well in the event stockpiles are depleted and resupply poses a bit of a challenge. When building out your evacuation plan, you need to make sure you have tested and validated every aspect of the plan before activating it. Make sure your people have been read on to the plan. When you draft your evacuation plan, ideally we want to have taking a phased approach to the evac. So we want to have specific indicators and triggers for activating that plan with clear instructions for our people in every phase, including turning the plan off in the event the situation deteriorates to the point where it becomes too dangerous to move. We need to ensure we have clear accountability procedures, hence the importance of communications plan I mentioned earlier. We want to make sure we're keeping our vehicles prepped and staged at all times, fully fueled, equipped with all necessary emergency equipment. Ensure multiple assembly areas and evacuation points are identified, mapped, and validated as viable safe havens. Again, more on that in a minute. And make sure everyone in your organization is briefed on the location of those sites. Make sure you have enough vehicles and drivers to transport everyone within your organization, as well as their essential belongings. Redundancy, like comms and shelter in place planning, redundancy is important here too. So if a vehicle in your convoy breaks down, do you have a contingency plan to cross-load personnel and their essential belongings, or are all your vehicles overloaded? You have to consider all that before you launch your plan. Remember, security forces may close down main roads or restrict access to the airport or other essential hubs on short notice. So it's absolutely essential that we have alternate routes mapped out ahead of time and enough fuel in our vehicles to travel those routes. When we talk about movement, whether in a vehicle or on foot, really, try to move in groups of at least 4 people. Have multiple routes mapped out and memorized ahead of time, ideally circumventing those flashpoints and known flashpoints in your area. Track your location at all times on a hard copy map. Don't rely solely on GPS. Right? Stay in constant contact with your security team when you're moving. That'll make things go a little bit smoother in case additional assets need to be steered to your location in an emergency. Make sure you plan a few safe havens, hospitals, hotels, shopping centers along each route. However, in these types of environments, we want to avoid lingering near security checkpoints, cordons, police stations, government buildings, et cetera, to minimize our vulnerability in the event of some kind of protest violence or some kind of kinetic activity. A quick note on safe havens. I know it's not always possible, but the ideal safe haven is a location open 24 hours a day. The idea is to allow us to arrive without any kind of time restriction, and loiter for long periods if necessary, while we attempt to coordinate some kind of transportation back to our destination. If possible, look for locations that have multiple points of ingress and egress along 2 or more different streets. Depending on the situation in your area of operation, proximity to mass transportation could also be a plus. In the event personnel need to make a hasty exit from their safe haven prior to a link-up time, an established link-up time. If you're traveling to one of the airports, you need to take steps to mitigate your vulnerabilities there as well. Next, there we go. Avoid lingering in the public areas. Get out of the public spaces, the check-in kiosks, rental car facilities, taxi stands, baggage claim, etc., as quickly as possible. Bottom line, if you're departing, you want to get behind the security gates as fast as possible. If you're inbound, arriving, into the region for whatever reason, make sure you have a very detailed reception plan in place to minimize the time spent in exposed areas. Ensure you have a precise link-up location with your driver. Ensure you know the name, contact information. Ensure you have a photo of the driver. Set up a challenge and password to further ensure their identity. Get the make, model, tag number of the vehicle. You want to have all that well in advance of any travel to the region, so you're not trying to coordinate all that stuff while you're standing on the curbside outside the airport. Another note regarding overland movement in the region, and this is geared specifically towards clients operating near the conflict areas, near the LOC and further north along the border. Fratricide is going to be a concern. Explosive remnants of war, sometimes referred to as UXOs, unexploded ordnance, or UXOs, may also present a hazard in the conflict areas. Obviously, if you can avoid the conflict areas, do so. But if your operations in the region, for whatever reason, require overland movement in vicinity of the LOC or further north along the border, make sure your routes are very carefully planned and coordinated with the proper authorities. Ensure personnel travel only on established routes and on clearly marked paths. Avoid all areas where locals refuse to travel, and learn the local spelling and signs as we have up here, and symbols commonly used to mark any kind of minefield or UXO site in the area. Also, I want to briefly outline responses to potential second and third order effects here. Yes, as John said, much of the kinetic activity appears to be confined within a few kilometers, within the LOC and in other pockets along the border, but clients need to brace for cascading effects elsewhere. As John already touched on, critical infrastructure is going to be impacted, hence the importance of a robust comms and shelter-in-place plan. An increased security posture could bring about additional curfews and movement restrictions, obviously hindering travel, which could essentially negate your evacuation plan. On a side note there, an increased security posture is also already resulting in the deployment of some less experienced reserve personnel. So in the early days of these types of conflicts, security forces are already very tense, and quite honestly, adding a batch of poorly trained part-time security personnel to the mix isn't going to do much to soften that edge. So if you're confronted by security forces for whatever reason, comply with all their instructions immediately, and do not attempt to bypass a security cordon, whether it's a fixed position or some kind of mobile convoy security for whatever reason. Even an accidental breach of a security cordon may prompt security forces to respond aggressively. So just be cognizant of that. Moving on. The potential for a surge in civil unrest on both sides of the border is going to increase as this thing drags out. If you happen to get caught up in some kind of demonstration, right, immediately attempt to detach yourself from the group without drawing attention to yourself. Keep as low a profile as possible while simultaneously making your way to the rear and the outer edge of the crowd. Exit as quickly as possible down a side street or into a shop. But remember, government buildings, embassies, and police stations can be targets in these types of situations. So you want to avoid those kinds of locations as much as possible. If you find yourself caught up in a demonstration where security forces employed any kind of riot control agent, move into the wind and do your best to distance yourself from the nearby demonstrators. Move into the wind until you reach fresh air. Flush your eyes with clean water for at least 15 to 20 minutes. If you're wearing contacts, remove them and discard them. They're no good anymore. Remove any contaminated clothing, but try and avoid pulling your shirt or your coat over your head. Wash your any contaminated skin. Wash your eyeglasses if you have them with soap and water very thoroughly, but do not use any kind of oil-based solution or solutions that contain bleach. Contaminated clothing should be discarded if possible, or thoroughly washed several times with cold water. And obviously, seek medical attention if breathing difficulties or eye or skin irritation persist. And as John said, it's unlikely, but clients should also nonetheless prepare for an uptick in decentralized kinetic activity beyond the LOC in the border areas. If a threat is perceived or some kind of attack occurs, whatever the tactic, technique, and procedure employed, think time, distance, and cover. If you can, leave yourself enough time to evaluate the situation before committing to a response, or a course of action, to ensure you're not running into something worse, a complex coordinated attack, secondary explosive, or follow-on assault, etc. If time is limited, immediately put distance between yourself and the threat. Get off the X, as we say, and move towards one of your safe havens. If you can't put distance between you and the threat, look for cover, right? Get behind cover, something that stops bullets, fragmentation, debris, etc. However, don't linger any longer than necessary. Once the opportunity to move presents itself, act quickly and decisively and create space between you and the threat. And finally, from an organizational perspective, that was a lot of individual resilience, techniques, but from an organizational perspective, now's as good a time as any for risk managers and EHS personnel with people in the region to review their local emergency response plans. And when I say emergency response plans or emergency action plans, I'm specifically referring to those plans designed to ensure life safety, right? That's always our number one rule as security professionals. So validate your plan, take any corrective actions as soon as possible to plug any gaps you find. Risk managers should also take the time now to review any and all applicable insurance policies. But remember that insurance is just a funding tool in the end. It's not a plan. If you need any assistance, do not hesitate to contact WorldAware at any time, and we'll be happy to discuss and propose some solutions.